You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your PMP certification journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Iteration and release planning begins with a clear purpose. Align the near-term work with the roadmap's themes and the measurable benefits those themes promise, then produce a credible plan for the next few iterations or releases that stakeholders can rely on. That alignment means making the inevitable trade-offs explicit: scope versus date versus quality versus risk, so choices are transparent and defensible rather than opaque and emotional. Use this planning when fixed dates loom, scope drifts, or compliance gates require traceable evidence. Read timeframes slowly when you narrate them, 1 to 4 week iterations, quarterly release windows, so listeners register the cadence while you emphasize value first, risk next as your guiding principle. A practical outcome of solid iteration and release planning is credibility. Leaders and teams share a realistic view of what will be delivered, when, and why. Credibility reduces constant back and forth and the temptation to micromanage, because the plan shows how each increment ties to benefit owners and what evidence will demonstrate progress. When forecasts are expressed as ranges, for example 2 to 3 iterations rather than a single date, stakeholders can choose trade-offs with clearer expectations about risk and contingency. This approach lowers stress and increases the probability that delivered increments actually produce intended outcomes rather than merely ticking boxes. Good planning surfaces governance touchpoints early so audit, regulatory, or executive reviews do not appear as late surprises. Identify decision rights and approval thresholds up front. Who must sign a compliance pack? Which artifacts feed a stage gate? And which milestones trigger budget or scope reviews? When these touchpoints are visible in the plan, teams know where to deposit evidence and when to expect sign-offs. This prevents hinge point chaos and keeps iteration work aligned with organizational accountability. The simple rule is to design plans that honor both delivery cadence and the governance calendar without compromising either. Input quality determines plan realism, so start planning with an ordered backlog, credible capacity or velocity estimates, a map of dependencies, and known constraints like holidays or supplier lead times. Include benefit targets and compliance obligations so trade-offs weigh value and risk rather than abstract feature counts. Pull historical flow metrics, recent throughput, median cycle time, to set reasonable expectations rather than optimistic ones. When you place decision rights and approval thresholds next to these inputs, it becomes clear who will authorize changes and under what conditions, which is essential when trade-offs ripple across domains. Decision rights and approval thresholds deserve explicit mention because they affect how far the team can commit without seeking external permission. For example, a product owner may reorder top-of-backlog items freely, but moving a compliance-related scope into a release may require executive approval or a legal sign-off. Record those thresholds in the plan and attach quick decision templates so when issues arise, the person asked to decide has the evidence and authority to move things forward. This visibility reduces delay and keeps governance proportional to risk rather than reflexively heavy. Iteration planning is a focused negotiation. Agree a concise sprint or iteration goal, pull backlog items that fit both the goal and the team's capacity, and ensure each selected item has clear acceptance criteria and a place in the definition of done. Avoid overplanning by breaking items into tasks only when task-level coordination actually helps the team. Otherwise, keep work at the story level so teams preserve flexibility. Reserve policy-defined capacity for expected interrupts like production support or expedite lanes so iteration plans remain realistic instead of being derailed by routine volatility. When you set an iteration goal, make it a single sentence that captures the desired outcome rather than a laundry list of features. A clear goal acts as a decision filter when mid-iteration trade-offs emerge. If an incoming request conflicts, ask whether it contributes to the goal. If not, defer. Confirm acceptance criteria so there is no ambiguity about what done means for each item, and make sure the definition of done includes necessary compliance checks or non-functional tests. These small but rigorous steps prevent late discovery of required changes that would otherwise inflate scope mid-iteration. Capacity assumptions must be explicit in planning conversations. State expected team availability, account for holidays or training, and quantify planned support load so the team does not overcommit. Use recent velocity or throughput as a baseline, then subtract known capacity drains to arrive at a practical commitment. Document the assumptions beside the iteration plan so reviewers understand the difference between ideal capacity and realistic delivery bandwidth. This habit makes reforecasting and stakeholder conversations far more efficient when the unexpected happens. Release planning should be rolling and evidence-driven. Group increments into a series of releasable slices that map to benefit milestones, rather than one massive drop at the end. Use velocity or throughput to derive range dates. Say, we expect to reach this benefit window in 3 to 5 iterations, and flag external dependencies and lead times that could shift the horizon. Build review checkpoints into the plan to reforecast and reslice based on evidence from completed increments, keeping governance and stakeholders involved without choking iteration cadence. Think of release planning as sequencing learning as much as delivering features. Arrange incremental releases that deliver usable value and that test the most important assumptions early. A rolling release plan recognizes that the roadmap is a hypothesis to be validated. Each increment should either deliver value or produce learning that informs subsequent slices. Use burn-up charts or simple milestone visuals to make progress transparent and to show how evidence changes the shape of future releases rather than a single immutable waterfall date. Flagging external dependencies in the release plan prevents surprises. Identify supplier lead times, certification windows, or third-party integration schedules, and make those constraints explicit in milestone calculations. Negotiate earliest needed interfaces to reduce coupling and sequence work so the critical path is visible. When external lead times drive the schedule, consider parallelizing internal learning work that does not depend on that interface so the project produces value while waiting for the dependency to clear. Slicing and sequencing for value requires a ruthless focus on delivering minimal viable slices that test the riskiest assumptions first. Prioritize value first and risk next. Break large features into vertical slices that produce usable results and reduce integration risk, and pull high-risk items forward since learning sooner is cheaper than late discovery. Defer polish items that improve aesthetics but don't change outcomes until the core value is proven, keeping delivery lean and feedback-driven. Sequence work to minimize handoffs and context switching, because each handoff and multiplied work in progress increases delay risk and reduces predictability. Organize slices to keep knowledge close. Favor vertical cuts that one team can own end-to-end over horizontal splits that demand many small handoffs. Keep benefit owners in the room when sequencing choices are made, so trade-offs reflect strategic priorities rather than developer convenience. That alignment reduces rework and accelerates decisive acceptance. Reserve capacity for support and expedite items as a policy, not as an ad hoc exception so iteration commitments are credible. A simple policy might allocate a percentage of capacity for expected interrupts and a small expedite lane for critical incidents. State those policies in the plan so stakeholders understand the built-in buffer. This practice protects predictable delivery while acknowledging operational realities and communicates how the team will handle urgent work without jeopardizing the roadmap. When you group increments toward benefit milestones, make each milestone a testable assertion. If we deliver these slices, we expect X increase in customer activation or Y reduction in cycle time. Tie acceptance and measurement plans to these assertions so the release decision is evidence-based. Publish what will be measured at each milestone and how success will be judged, so the release decision is about observed outcomes rather than subjective impressions. Keeping governance focused on value realization. Embed governance and compliance into the plan by placing required checks into the definition of done and relevant events rather than standing up separate side gates that disrupt flow. Define the evidence package each gate requires and where those artifacts will live, so approval is a straightforward verification step. Publish escalation and emergency policies in the plan so exceptions follow pre-agreed paths, and ensure release notes and approvals are synchronized with the artifact repository for traceability. This approach reduces bureaucracy while preserving auditability. When dependencies span teams, visualize cross-team links and assign integration owners to hold the end-to-end view. Reduce coupling by stabilizing API contracts, using feature toggles to decouple deployment from release, and employing stubs or mocks during early integration to validate behavior before full integration is ready. Negotiate earliest needed interfaces first to minimize critical path surprises, and reorder backlog items to unblock that path when sensible. These practices keep releases predictable and reduce the chance of late-stage integration chaos. Reforecasting is part of the rhythm. At each demo or retrospective, review what was learned, update range forecasts, and refresh assumptions. Share concise visuals, a burn-up to the target, or a simple milestone chart, accompanied by a one-line interpretation so stakeholders can act without wading through data. Explain why changes happened and present options with clear trade-offs. Compress scope, add resources, or accept a date change with consequences. Maintain a single source of truth for dates and scope so everyone references the same current plan. Scenario: a fixed compliance date looms while scope uncertainty is still high, and integration risks remain. Options might include freezing scope immediately to preserve the date, delivering an end-to-end thin slice that satisfies compliance early, and then expanding features, pushing the date to reduce risk, or adding more review meetings to micromanage progress. The best next action is to deliver a thin compliance slice first that validates the core evidence path, value first, risk next, document the verification steps, and then refine subsequent slices with the remaining capacity while preserving date confidence through visible evidence. Delivering a thin compliance slice preserves the release date's credibility by demonstrating that the critical regulatory path is achievable, while buying time to sequence remaining features based on learning. This path also produces audit artifacts early that calm governance stakeholders and reduces late-stage surprises. Communicate clearly. Show what was delivered, which compliance checks passed, what remains, and which trade-offs the team recommends for the remaining scope to preserve either date or breadth of features. Avoid common pitfalls, such as committing to a single date without ranges, ignoring dependencies that later become critical path, or underestimating hidden compliance work that appears only at handover. The remedy is a short playbook. State goals, slice for learning and value, calculate capacity and present range-based forecasts, collect evidence for gates, and refresh plans regularly as facts arrive. This loop, plan, deliver, learn, replan, keeps releases credible, reduces late rework, and aligns delivery to demonstrable benefits rather than wishes. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Governance and compliance belong inside the delivery flow rather than as side gates that spring surprises at the last minute. Design your definition of done to include required checks, so compliance evidence accumulates as a natural part of work rather than as an afterthought. Specify which artifacts prove compliance, test reports, signed attestations, configuration snapshots, and make those artifacts part of the increments acceptance checklist. When compliance steps are woven into every increment, approvals at release become verification rather than discovery. Explain to stakeholders that embedding checks preserves cadence. The team produces smaller, auditable increments, and governance gets timely assurance without forcing ad hoc, heavyweight audits that stall progress and create friction at the handover moment. Translate governance needs into evidence packs and explicit sign-off points so nobody is surprised at review time. An evidence pack is a concise folder containing the specific documents reviewers need to validate a release, such as the integration test summary, security scan results, and the compliance checklist with signatures. Define who will sign which part of the pack and under what conditions, and map those sign-offs into the release plan as named, scheduled checkpoints. When approvals are required, give reviewers short, decision-ready artifacts rather than a dump of raw logs. A one-page executive summary plus attached evidence wins faster decisions. This practice turns governance from an audit chore into an efficient validation step that supports repeated, safe releases. Publish escalation and emergency policies alongside the plan so exceptions follow an agreed path rather than ad hoc decisions that undermine trust. Define what constitutes an emergency, who may authorize a temporary deviation from normal controls, how temporary compensating controls will be implemented, and the timeline and requirements for returning to the standard compliance posture. When deviations occur, require a brief post-event report that explains the emergency, the compensating controls used, the impact, and the remediation plan. Making these rules explicit protects the organization from ad hoc risk-taking and ensures everyone understands both the flexibility available and the accountability expected when circumstances demand it. Integration owners are the single visible point for cross-team dependencies, and they make integration risk manageable by holding the end-to-end view and negotiating interfaces proactively. Visualize cross-team links in an integration map that shows which teams own which components, which APIs must be stable by when, and which milestones require coordinated delivery. Give each integration owner the authority to convene necessary stakeholders, set interface contracts, and drive smoke tests so the critical path becomes a shared focus rather than a hidden assumption. This clarity turns integration risk into a tractable program of early agreements, contract tests, and incremental validation. Reduce coupling by specifying API contracts early and by using feature toggles, stubs, or mocks to decouple deployment from release. Describe the contract in plain terms, inputs, outputs, error modes, and performance expectations, and require a simple contract test suite that consumers run during their builds so mismatches are detected early. Feature toggles allow you to deploy code safely behind a switch and to separate release timing from deployment timing. Stubs and mocks enable teams to progress without waiting for every real endpoint. These technical practices are governance-friendly because they trade brittle, late integration for predictable, testable handoffs. Negotiate earliest needed interfaces first by asking a practical question in planning sessions. Which interface, if late, stops other teams from delivering? Prioritize the design, test harness, and a minimal acceptance contract for that interface so downstream teams can continue work against a stable approximation. Reorder the backlog to unblock the critical path where necessary, and invest in small integration spikes that validate essential contracts quickly. This pragmatic sequencing reduces late surprises and keeps the program moving, while preserving the ability to adapt as real feedback arrives from integration testing and early deployments. Reforecasting is not an admission of failure, but a disciplined response to new evidence. Use every demo and retrospective as a mini reforecast opportunity. At each demo, capture what was built, what assumptions were tested, and whether outcomes matched expectations. Then update your release ranges and capacity assumptions in light of that evidence. When reforecasting, present a short visual summary, a burn-up to the target or a simple milestone chart, and a one-line interpretation that explains the change and its options. This keeps stakeholders informed without drowning them in data and makes reforecasting a routine governance action rather than an emergency scramble. When you communicate changes, always state the why and the options available so stakeholders can choose trade-offs with understanding. Avoid presenting a revised date alone. Explain which assumptions shifted, less velocity, a new dependency, or an unexpected defect trend, and offer concrete choices such as reducing scope, adding temporary resources with clear costs, or accepting a date change with mitigation steps. Pair the choice with the evidence that prompted it and a recommended path forward. That honest, options-based communication preserves credibility and allows leaders to take informed responsibility for the trade-offs. Keep a single source of truth for dates, scope, and approvals so everyone pulls the same artifact when they need information. This repository should show the current release plan, the evidence packs, the decision log, and any escalations with outcomes. Avoid parallel spreadsheets or ad hoc slide decks that fragment the record and create confusion. A single versioned plan with brief change notes accelerates audits and reduces repeated clarification meetings because the history of choices is discoverable and the provenance of each date or scope decision is clear. Scenario: the program faces a fixed compliance deadline while significant scope uncertainty and integration risk remain, and stakeholders offer competing remedies. Option 1 is to freeze scope immediately and proceed to verify the frozen slice. Option 2 is to build a thin end-to-end compliance slice that exercises the compliance path and then expand functionality in later increments. Option 3 is to push the compliance date to allow more learning, and Option 4 is to add more governance meetings to chase consensus without changing delivery. Pause and think. What preserves date confidence while reducing the chance of late failure? Delivering a thin, compliant, end-to-end slice first is usually the most pragmatic choice because it directly addresses the compliance risk without sacrificing the ability to learn. By proving the compliance path early, you generate the artifacts reviewers need and reduce the biggest unknown in the schedule. This approach buys time to sequence remaining features based on validated integration behavior and measured capacity, and it gives governance the evidence to make informed acceptance decisions. Document what the slice proves, which tests and attestations passed, and which residual risks remain so subsequent planning proceeds from facts rather than optimism. The strongest distractor is adding more meetings without changing the plan because meetings consume stakeholder time without delivering evidence. Likewise, freezing scope blindly can preserve a date, but may lock in a poor product outcome if the frozen scope fails to deliver expected value. Pushing the date may be necessary if the compliance requirement changes in substance rather than schedule, but it should be a last resort after the thin slice test has shown the compliance path's viability. The thin slice approach balances value-first thinking with risk reduction, preserves auditability, and keeps the program learning. Pitfalls in iteration and release planning usually emerge from 3 habits: committing to a single brittle date, ignoring hidden dependencies that later become the critical path, and treating compliance or non-functional work as a checkbox done at the end. Avoid these by adopting range-based forecasts, by visually surfacing dependencies and integration owners early, and by including compliance evidence in the definition of done for each increment. These simple disciplines reduce late surprises and align delivery with governance expectations without adding bureaucratic friction to the team's day-to-day. A concise playbook keeps planning practical. Start with clear goals, slice the roadmap into learnable increments, calculate capacity and present release ranges rather than single dates, define the evidence required for gates, and refresh the plan at each demo and retrospective. Add practical governance, steps named integration owners, evidence packs, and explicit escalation policies, so approvals are fast and traceable. Repeat the loop: plan, deliver a thin slice, prove assumptions, and replan. This keeps releases credible, manages risk early, and focuses teams on delivering measurable benefits rather than negotiating last-minute compromises. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.